A shocking murder in a luxury apartment not far from an elite Ivy League school. Law enforcement says a star athlete died at the hands of his own brother. Both were former college soccer players who grew up in a wealthy family. Plus, an ominous poem, a golf club, a knife, and a cat, all involved in this horrifying crime. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Right now, law enforcement in New Jersey are searching for a motive in the death of a former college soccer star. This is 26-year-old Joseph Hertgen. His friends and family called him Joe or Joey. And this is a picture from his time as a soccer player at the University of Michigan. And if you know college athletics, if you're playing for Michigan, if you're playing in the Big Ten Conference like Joe did, that means you're one of the best. After his playing days were over, he went on to get a job as an analyst at a financial management company. Here's his page on the company's website. A former athlete and a college grad at the start of what appeared to be a promising career. But now, police are trying to figure out the horror of what happened inside his apartment and why his older brother, Matthew, would allegedly kill him using a golf club and a knife and then set the family cat on fire. This is Matthew's mugshot after his arrest. So let's lay out what we know from law enforcement at this point. They tell us that at 11:22 p.m. on February 22nd, it was Matthew who called 911 saying there was a dead body in the apartment. And when I say apartment, this is not the single bedroom, small quarters type place that many of us moved into after college. This was a luxury apartment complex. Take a look at the website that advertises units with 9-foot ceilings, gas fireplaces, oak tread staircases. According to Zillow, we looked this up, units in this building go for more than $4,000 a month to rent, and they can sell for more than $1 million up to $2 million. Not to mention the location, not far from the picturesque campus of the elite Ivy League university, Princeton. But for as nice as that luxury apartment is, police right now say it was in that unit that they found Joseph Hertgen, and they say he was beaten by a golf club, then slashed by a knife, and again, the family's cat was also killed. Let's talk about the suspect in this case, the older brother, Matthew, who, according to social media, according to what we've been able to learn about him, was a standout in his own right before he became a suspect in a murder. He also played college soccer. Here's his picture from his time at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. That is an elite liberal arts college. And looking at his social media page, it also appears up until 2018, this 31-year-old really looked the part of a former athlete starting his life after school. Take a look at this picture on his Facebook page of he and his friends from 2018. But then you look at his page as of late, and it appears, at least from social media, his life took a bit of a dark turn. This is his profile picture. You can see it's very abstract. Starting in 2023, he also posted these drawings. And then this really grabbed our attention. This is a poem that he posted on September 6th of 2024. And I want to read part of it for you. Quote, "He still has a pulse, blood still flows through his veins, but something is wrapping around him, squeezing him, choking him, suffocating him, tightly wound around his head. Fastened deep in his throat, blood oozes out of his eyes, his ears are sparking, his face vibrates, he convulses, and he doesn't stop. He's lost, he's asleep, he's dead." And this poem continues on. Then on February 21st of this year, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he posted this picture on Facebook. And remember, it was just before 11:30 p.m. the next day. Police say he called them on 911 about that body that he said was in his apartment complex. That body would be that of his brother. Laying next to him, also in this picture we noticed, that appears to be a cat toy, and police did say the family's cat died because he set it on fire. Joining us now to dive into this investigation further is former NYPD Detective Sergeant Dan Murphy, also the host of the Gold Shields podcast. Thank you, Dan, for taking the time to be with us today. This is a story that's getting a lot of attention because the family appears to come from a lot of wealth, former soccer stars, they were brothers. What stands out to you as an investigator when you see what we've learned thus far?
Well, anything that happens within a family is always going to be is going to have a lot of history, a lot of dynamics going on, a lot of sibling rivalry. This case is sibling rivalry on steroids. This is such savagery between brothers. There's going to be, no matter how you slice it, there's going to be a lot of history between the two of them that's going to come out. It hasn't come out yet, but it will. There's just no way to avoid that. And what that is, we don't know yet. But this is interesting because you're going to have to interview the entire family. You're going to have to look at all the communications between the brothers, talk to their friends, and find out how could this relationship have gotten to this point.
I look at the social media of Matthew, and from just the public, when you look at the page, who knows if you were his friends on Facebook, like if you would see more, but there's images from 2018. He played soccer at Wesleyan, which is this elite liberal arts college in Connecticut. You know, looks the role of, the way I put it, is kind of that kid that, like, yeah, that's a kid who would have played soccer at Wesleyan. And then there's like a 5-year gap where there's not really a lot of posting publicly. And then you get to 2023, and there are these pictures, these kind of like scribble drawings. There's that long graphic poem that he posted. And then you see pictures of him, and it's like the mugshot. He looks very unkempt. He has the beard. When you look at the social media, what do you see?
I see somebody whose life was in decline. It just appears to be that over the course of those 5 years, he went from somebody who fit the mold of where he came from, a family of privilege, Toms River, New Jersey, on to great schools, played soccer, seemed to have the world, as his oyster. And then all of a sudden, things start changing. It could be drugs. It could be mental health. It could be a combination, alcohol. It could be relationship issues. Whatever it was started putting him going off in a bad direction. And those pictures are very telling. Pictures in time of 2018 and 2023 really show a stark difference. And that stark difference, behind that's a story. And in that somewhere is the relationship with the brother.
And still at this point, I mean, online, you have people who knew this family talking about that they, hate using the phrase all-American family, but it seems like that's something that would be labeled on this family from New Jersey. A lot of people memorializing Joe, but we haven't heard a lot about Matthew at this point. So you just wonder what he went through over these past 5 years. And I'm sure that'll come to light as this case goes forward. I think of police as well in this situation, where they get this phone call, 911, from Matthew at 11:22 p.m. and he says that there's a dead body in the apartment. We haven't heard the 911 call yet to hear what the tone would have been. But if you were responding to that scene, what is going through your mind when you get that type of call from a dispatcher?
You're preparing yourself mentally for a horrific crime scene. I mean, somebody says there's a dead body, calls up and says it can be anything, but you always prepare yourself. This can be a crime scene. Treat every dead body as though it is a crime scene. You have a caller calling up. You want that person. You want to get a statement from them as soon as possible. What did they see? When did they get here? Do they know the person? How did they get in? Whatever, all that kind of stuff. And then you start making sure that the evidence gets preserved. You want to look at the body. You want to see that in this case, it's not a natural death. It's obvious. There's blood. There's all manner of indication this was a homicide. You've got to preserve that scene. You've got to preserve your witnesses. You've got to keep your wits about you while still looking at something that is disturbing to any human being, which is a brutal murder. And even the cat, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's not usual, not typical. And in Princeton, New Jersey, they do not get scores and scores of homicides. This is a very unusual call for an officer from anywhere, and particularly an area like Princeton. So when you go there, you've got to keep your wits about you, and you've got to make sure that you do not let witnesses or evidence get lost, destroyed, or walk away.
Yeah, and let's talk about the manner of death. I mean, it is graphic. Joe was allegedly killed with a golf club and a knife. What type of scene did police walk into? And you talk about preserving the scene. I mean, what are the different pieces of evidence that you need to grab that are going to play out in this case when it eventually goes to trial?
Exactly. Well, first of all, when you first get there, you have the caller. If he is inside the apartment at that time, you've got to remove him from the apartment. You got to get him outside. You have to treat that apartment, the entire scene, and maybe even the hallway steps leading to it, back outside. You create a wide crime scene because you don't know what you'll need. There can be evidence outside in bushes, in front of a car. So you're going to create a wider crime scene than you think you need initially. And you're going to want to preserve everything. Now, in a stabbing case, unlike certain other types of homicide, like asphyxiation and things like that, you're going to have a lot of blood, obviously. And if it's multiple stab wounds, you're going to have blood spatter. And the blood spatter is going to tell the story. It's going to say what angle the knife went in, knives went in at, how many times the person was stabbed. You'll see that on the body during the autopsy, but you'll see the spatter, and it'll tell you exactly where things took place in that apartment, because the person might have wandered off after being stabbed and fell down in a different room. And these are all things that need to be created by capable and experienced crime scene investigators and detectives, using forensics and understanding the nature of a homicide like this. These are the kind of things that can be very shocking, but are vitally important to the prosecution, because a prosecution, remember, has to present a theory. And the theory has to be, this is what happened based upon the evidence. So it's very important for the initial officers to rope that off, put that crime scene tape up, take bigger than you think you'll need. You can always peel it back. You can never regain an area once it's been lost. So the sanctity of that crime scene has to be, the integrity must be maintained at first. It's vitally important.
Yeah, I just think of those officers, and you have this phone call, you know you're walking into a potentially disturbing situation, and I just imagine you open the door and you come across this scene. It's horrific. And I mean, I don't, you've been an investigator. I mean, I don't know how many years you would have to be a police officer for that not to shock you. And then you have this person who allegedly did this. It's just incredible to think of what a police officer has to process in split seconds, because you also, I'm sure, are worried about your own safety. If someone's willing to do this to their own brother, allegedly, what they would do to anybody else walking in that door. I want to turn to the poem. We read part of it. It's gory. It was written in September of last year, so this was several months before what happened. What did you take away from it? I mean, it's literally talking about someone being choked out. Maybe he meant it figuratively. If it's a mental health issue, we don't know. But what did you make of seeing that on his Facebook page?
You know, I wasn't overly surprised, because for someone, if you look at the total picture, you have a person who during the course of the past 5 years appears to be degrading in his life into a different state than what he normally was for most of his life. He's going in a different direction. He writes this poem. This poem is an indication of dark thoughts, perhaps dark intentions, not the kind of thing the average person writes about, unless you're writing a fiction novel or some graphic novel. For the most part, this is the type of stuff of somebody whose thoughts are not right, for lack of a better word. Now, for him to go on after writing that and doing what he did indicates he has been thinking about homicide in a general way, and maybe even in a more specific way than he wrote about. He's been thinking about it, toying with the idea. And maybe it was about his brother, maybe it was about somebody else, maybe his brother was the first person to cross his radar when it really came to fruition in his mind. It went from thought to action. So this is not unusual for me in looking back at cases I've looked at where people leak, so to speak. They let their intentions be known somehow. And in this way, he chose to do it in a veiled way. But nonetheless, he was expressing an intention to commit, or at least visualize, a murder.
I want to talk about the other part of this. Is there was a cat that was allegedly lit on fire. I mean, that's a horrific part of it too. Certainly an additional charge on top of what he's facing, along with the alleged murder of his brother. What does that tell you, though, as far as someone who would be willing to not only do that to their own brother, but as you build a case against this person, you also have this severe case of animal cruelty that was found in the apartment?
It seems to me, and we don't know whose cat exactly it was, but if it belonged to the victim, or the victim had any concern for that cat and cared for it whatsoever, then this would be just icing on the cake. I'm going to kill or destroy everything you care and love about. Everything that's big to you or important to you, I'm going to kill. I'm going to crush. And the cat became a victim of that. That, to me, is what that indicates.
We have the mugshot of the suspect, Matthew Hertgen. He's now in custody, and presumably will be in custody for a long period of time, to say the least. If you were to interview him, you witness this scene, you take him under arrest, you sit down, you're sitting across from him. What are some of your first questions as you build this case?
Well, first of all, you're going to want to make sure you get his clothes, because they're going to have blood on it, and that's going to be evidence for you. So you're going to get all that kind of stuff. You're going to look at his phone. All that stuff is being done. When you sit down to talk to him, I think one of the first things I would want to do, obviously, you need to build rapport so he will feel free to speak with you. But once you do that, I would want to know about the relationship. Tell me about your brother and just see how he reacts to that. If he reacts with fondness or if he denies doing it right away, then that's different. But if he just starts talking about his brother, if he's not denying it right away, if he's not saying, I didn't do this, then now I know at some point he called 911. He wanted his brother's body to be found soon, right away, which is not unusual either for killers. Sometimes they'll put a blanket over it because they want to make it look better or less gross. It's weird. There's a love and hate relationship here, but I would ask him about his brother. Tell me about your relationship with your brother and see where he goes from there.
How quickly, when you're interviewing someone who's been accused of such a heinous crime, can you tell whether this is someone who would fit the mold of an insanity defense?
I'm not an expert to do that. There are legal knowing right from wrong and all that stuff, and it's really not a detective's determination to do that. But if during the course of your questioning, these are the things that you will relay to the district attorney. You know, this person spoke incoherently. This person said the following things. If you're videotaping it, as you should, that interrogation is going to become a vital piece of evidence as to whether or not this is an insanity defense or the person knew what they were doing at the time and they knew the repercussions and consequences of their actions. And those are all, deeper legal questions. But for a detective, it's very vital to make sure everything about the person's behavior, that's why video is so important, about the person's behavior, the things that they say, the way they say it, the way they're able to follow your questions. All that will play into whether or not the DA makes that determination to allow that or pursue it or to debunk it and fight it in court.
A big part of this case and why it's one that is getting national headlines, certainly you have the dynamic that they're brothers, that they played college soccer at these elite schools, but it's the privilege. It's the fact that they came from a wealthy family. Princeton, New Jersey, for people who have never been, I mean, it is a pristine place to live, and they certainly, the family owned real estate in a pristine place as well. In your experience, how common is it to see these types of cases play out within families that seem to have every resource available to them to potentially treat someone who is either mentally ill or having issues?
Well, I wouldn't say particularly more that you would see it among people who have wealth. I think family dynamics are family dynamics regardless. People who have wealth and privilege have the opportunity to seek out help and assistance that can move situations away. They aren't always able to do it, though, or able to even recognize that there's a need. Now, in this case, I would go out on a limb and I would say that the suspect probably didn't have a lot of contact with the family, or the family didn't have a lot of understanding of exactly where he was and where he might be going in his life. And that could happen in any family. But with privilege, it always makes it more interesting because we think, these folks have everything at their disposal. Why can't they just work out their problems? But some of these problems are so deeply rooted, and members of family can be in denial at times about the problem within their own family. They don't want to reveal it. They don't want to, they're embarrassed by it, or they don't want to acknowledge that it exists. And some of that may be the case here. But I do think that family dynamics are what they are, whether you have little money or a lot of money. And little money stresses can make them more, and big money stresses can make them more exaggerated as well.
Yeah, it's interesting the idea, what contact did he have with his family during these difficult periods of times? Because at least the stories I've seen in just a couple of days since this has made headlines, there's not a lot of people talking about the contact that they've had with him over the past couple of years. And I also looked and on Facebook, and take it for what it's worth, it didn't seem that Matthew and Joseph were friends on that platform. And that could play into something about, what type of contact they had, what type of communication they had. It's definitely a story that has grabbed headlines because of a lot of the things that factor into it. But at the end of the day, a sad one because you have a young man who seemed to have everything headed in the right direction. And he lost his life. I want to thank former NYPD Detective Sergeant Dan Murphy for joining us, also the host of the Gold Shield podcast. Dan, it's always great to have you here on Law&Crime.
Thank you, Chris. My pleasure. Anytime.
Joining us now to talk more about this is New Jersey certified criminal defense attorney Michael Korbanix. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I know this happened not too far from where you're located in New Jersey. And let's set the scene here a little bit, because this is a family that appears to have had a lot of money, wealth, privilege, and certainly it happened in a part of the state where you typically do not see murder investigations like this.
This is a very unusual situation. Like you said, I believe it was a $2 million condominium they lived in, and this was such a unusual situation where you have one brother allegedly murdering another brother, and not only that, but you have that person who's the alleged murderer calling the police to come to the place where this all occurred, and he's there. And in addition to killing his brother, there was also a pet cat killed. So it's a very interesting case, and it's going to see where it goes when we find out how much kind of video and things of that nature, because we're in a whole new world of internet and things of that nature and computers. So police have a lot of videos, they have body cams and things of that nature. So it's going to be interesting to see the discovery they have here for what happened not only before this incident, but on that night.
I looked through his Facebook page, the suspect, Matthew, and it seems like 2018 and social media only shows you so much, but he looks very different than the person that we see in the mugshot that was released by law enforcement. And also the posts that he had really starting in 2023, there were these long poems, there were these drawings. What do you make of what you saw when you looked at his social media pages?
Well, the posts he had in September, about 5 months prior to this incident, really seemed like a prediction or a plan at what occurred this past Saturday night in Princeton, New Jersey, when he allegedly murdered his brother, which is scary because that's going to be extremely strong evidence for the state in their prosecution of this case.
If you were his defense attorney, how do you push back against seeing what many of us see on the outside when you look at his social media pages, where you say that this is someone who was, I mean, even you said it, like plotting what allegedly took place just last weekend in New Jersey?
Well, I think the first step I would take with a client like this is to look into, quite frankly, his mental health. And did he actually have the mental health where he did this and he wasn't, quite frankly, insane in what he did? And I think that's the first thing you'd have to look for, because that posting is clearly something that's going to lock him in from a sense of proof in front of a jury.
How do you build, as a defense attorney, what would be an insanity defense? I mean, this was an incredibly brutal crime. Clearly, this was someone who was, just in terms of, from the outside looking in, someone who's not in the right mind to have done something like this. If you were to build an insanity defense, how do you take what we know of this case thus far and build that if you were defending this person?
Well, what you need to do is you need to find a psychological or psychiatrist who is an expert in mental health, and you have to have them evaluated. And once you have them evaluated, you have to then have that expert be able to try to connect the evidence and what he did and how he did it, and if he had the mental capacity to actually have an intent, which is required for a murder under the statute, intent to do it, or did he have such a mental disability that he didn't have the intent to do that? But it's a tough struggle in this case, especially with those social media posts.
And we're still waiting to learn a lot more information just about how all of this came to be, the family history, how much contact did he have with his family. It's not entirely clear at this point, but you do have, if you were, again, putting you in the shoes of his counsel, someone who called 911, police discover this horrific scene. Presumably there's a lot of evidence that points to him as the suspect in this case. What does a defense attorney do? Like, what's the goal of a defense attorney in this when it does seem like this is someone who definitely committed this crime just based on the evidence? Obviously innocent until proven guilty, and everything's alleged at this point. But what do you do in a clear-cut case like this?
Well, first of all, you need to do some very strong investigation, because one of the things that could be, I mean, we don't have all the evidence that the government has it at this point in time, but also one would wonder is, does he have a self-defense defense in this case? Did he and his brother have some sort of prior miscommunications or some sort of conflicts where they were arguing and things of that nature, and it is something that just turned into a fight, and he fought and killed him, but he was doing it in self-defense? We don't know that, but that's something that needs to be explored. But once again, too, is like I always say, is we're criminal defense lawyers, we're not magicians. You have to be very frank with your client and let them know that, is there a way we can resolve this is the best way, as opposed to facing, life sentence.
When you see a cause of death, and I mean, this was from what the state has said, this is a brutal crime scene. To use a golf club, to use a knife, allegedly on your own brother. What do you take away from the fact that this was just such a gruesome murder?
Well, it appears that there had to have been, especially since there was those posts about that poem 5 months prior to it. There had to have been, which I don't know anything about, but I would assume there was some sort of controversy between him and his brother that kept leading from, probably a misunderstanding to this horrible event that occurred.
And beyond that, because I keep bringing up the idea of this cat that was also killed, because in some ways that's an additional charge on top of the murder charge. But when you think of the horrific way of killing an animal like this, how does that factor into kind of the profile of this person who's now facing a charge of murder?
Well, it's clearly builds the state's evidence against him, and the fact, once again, is, if I recall correctly, is I believe the day before this occurred, he posted something with one of the cat toys, and he had that blank look on his face when he took a picture of himself in the cat toy. So this shows, I think it's going to be very strong evidence for the government that this was clearly an intent, this was planned, and he was actually trying to draw attention to what he was going to do.
Yeah, it's incredibly chilling. And from what I've read, he's facing what could be up to 30 years to life in prison. Typically, what does the process look like in New Jersey going forward in murder cases like this?
Well, most of the time with any cases, you try to resolve it for the best thing you can get for your client. So, I mean, I would think once they look at the mental health issues, things of that nature, they would see what would be the best resolution as to what would be a fair plea into, if he took a plea, which would be less than 30 to life. Or the government could also say, we believe he needs life, so we're going to try the case.
In your experience, typically is, in the case of a murder, is it typically ever just completely sentenced to life in prison, or is that 30-year parole option typically on the table for defense? Obviously, we'll see how this case plays out and whether it actually goes to a trial. But if you were to be found guilty of the sentence that was laid out thus far.
Well, I think this kind of case with a sentence, I think a judge may have an inclination to sentence to life, but also there would be an inclination by the government to make sure that at his age, he's, I believe, 30, so a 25, 30-year sentence would be something that would be quite significant, and hopefully something, if he has some sort of mental disorder, that while incarcerated, he could get some sort of treatment and things of that nature to put him back on the right path if and when he gets released on parole.
One thing I always find fascinating about defense attorneys is taking on the role of representing someone who's accused of some pretty horrific crimes, just like in this case. Just for you, bring me inside the mindset of a defense attorney and working with someone who's been accused of really some unthinkable things, like in the case that we're talking about right now.
Well, your obligation is to be honest with your client. So you're not there to say, I'm a magician, I'm going to make this go away and, see what we're going to do. You've got to look at it in the best interest of your client, and you need to communicate with your client to let them know if they have strong evidence, they don't have strong evidence, and the risk you're taking by going to trial. And that's something you always have to keep your mind open with. Ultimately, it is always the defendant's decision as to what they're going to do. We are just there to advise them and defend them and hold the government to their obligation of proof beyond a reasonable doubt as best we can.
Is that something for you, just as a person, to have to like compartmentalize, like the idea of communicating with someone who's been accused of taking a life and someone who's a pretty dangerous person? I mean, what's the communication process like, knowing that this is a person that you're working with? I just always find that fascinating with defense attorneys.
Well, it's something that you have to really live up to your ethical standards, because you have to give them the best defense. But the one thing is, you just can't lie to your client and, tell them that you're going to perform a miracle or something of that nature. But you also have to try to get the thing that will help that client the most. For example, in this case, is you would want to retain someone who's a psychiatrist, who's an expert, who's dealt with these kind of cases before, who can give you some sort of guidance and some sort of strength to show the government that there is a way that this person, while being punished, also needs to be rehabilitated. So when he does get back, and if he does get released into society again, society could feel safe that he's gotten this. But you need some expert help as a criminal defense attorney. You need some experts from psychiatrists to put that together so you could communicate it fully and credibly.
This is a case that happened last weekend, this incident that happened last weekend. Obviously, there's been an arrest. With what you know about the criminal justice system in New Jersey, what would the timeline be, if you had to guess, of when there could be a trial and how long a trial could take based off the evidence that we know right now, which I know is still limited at this point?
A lot of that depends on how the government wants to proceed with it. But this could be a case that could take a year or two to get to trial. The trial, I don't know, with not having that much information, how long it could take, but it doesn't seem like it would be something that needs to be too long, because it's not going to be many witnesses other than this person's cell phone and his posting and whatever body videos they have or whatever phone call communications they have between the two brothers and what led up to this event that happened that evening in their family's condominium.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what type of communication there was within the family. And then, of course, the mystery of how the suspect in this case went from what appeared to be just a student at an elite college, a college soccer player, and then eventually now in the behind bars, accused of killing his brother. Certified criminal defense attorney Michael Korbanix, thank you for taking the time to be with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be on.
Prosecutors say that Matthew Hertgen could face up to 30 years to life in prison. We'll continue to follow this story as it develops. Around the Case, presented by Law&Crime, I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.